Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's one-hour webinar hosted by the IIB in partnership with Ernst & Young and WilmerHale. I'm Beth Zork, CEO of the IIB. Today, we are pleased to be joined by Donna Daniels, Managing Director, and Julia DeMarco, Senior Manager of Forensics and Integrity Services from EY, along with WilmerHale partners David Horn, Sean Thornton, and Yoon Hee Green. Our speakers today will discuss the legal authorities that are used to target banks and other corporate involvement in fentanyl-related activity, recent enforcement trends, pending legislative proposals, and compliance considerations and leading practices for financial institutions. Please submit your questions at any time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. CLE credit is being offered for today's program. An email was sent to you with the CLE affirmation forms earlier today. WilmerHale is facilitating the CLE certificates. We will also share presentation materials with all registrants after the webinar. And before I begin, I would just like to thank Donna, Julia, David, Sean, and Yoon Hee for joining us today and sharing your expertise on this important and evolving topic. And thank you as well, of course, to EY and WilmerHale for your continued support of the IIB. Because of you, we are able to provide critical programming such as today's webinar. With that, I'll turn it over to Yoon Hee to get us started.
Thanks so much, Beth. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As Beth mentioned, my name is Yoon Hee Green, and I'm a partner at the WilmerHale office in New York. I'm thrilled to be here with my fellow panelists and want to thank the IIB for hosting this webinar. As Beth mentioned, we're excited to talk about some really interesting and important issues arising out of the current administration's intensified efforts on combating the fentanyl crisis and how financial institutions and corporations are affected by it all. We're lucky to have such a terrific panel to talk through these complex and thorny issues. As Beth mentioned, David Horn and Sean Thornton are two of my partners at WilmerHale, and Donna Daniels and Julia DeMarco are from EY. Each of them have deep expertise in the topics we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves briefly before we dive in. I'll turn it over. I don't know who wants to go first.
I can go you and me because I'm on the slide, and you didn't tell everyone about your fantastic background at the Fed before you joined WilmerHale. But I smile. I'm Donna Daniels. I'm a managing director at EY. Been here about 10 years. Worked with clients on their compliance programs, including deep focus on financial crime compliance. Started as a litigator. Then I was at Citi, where I had some chief compliance officer and general counsel roles in terms of overseeing consumer products and distribution of investments. And then was the general counsel, head of compliance, and for a while the head of FinCrime, reporting into myself at Standard Chartered Bank during some of our trouble times, if you will, or sort of our first go-round of regulatory and enforcement issues. It's where I first met Yoon Hee, and now here we are presenting together. So happy to be here today and share insights and experience. And why don't I turn it to Julia, so we finish EY, and then she can pass.
Sounds great. Thanks, Donna. Hi, everybody. I'm Julia DeMarco. I'm Senior Manager in our forensics practice here at EY. I work with our clients in the financial services industry, often helping them with their complex regulatory and investigation matters and related to things like money laundering and sanctions, fraud, whistleblower, employee embezzlement, digital asset issues. So most recently, though, I've led a number of engagements related to cartel financing activity. And in those instances, I worked with the in-house legal, compliance, external counsel to identify and assess hundreds of thousands of transactions. And they ended up being linked to the Sinaloa cartel. And that work led to a number of suspicious activity report filing. So I'm really excited and happy to be here today to share some of that with you. And with that, maybe I'll pass it to Sean.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sean Thornton. I'm a partner at WilmerHale since December. Earlier, I was in-house counsel at a distinguished IIB member bank for about 10 years, 11 years. And a formative experience in my career was I spent about 11 years at the Treasury Department, including 7 years as chief counsel of OFAC. And I'm thrilled to practice with one of my distinguished successors, who I will introduce now, David.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks, everyone. I'm David Horn. I'm a partner at WilmerHale here in Washington, D.C. I practiced at WilmerHale for many, many years, primarily focusing on trade and national security law, financial crimes compliance, and the like. Most recently, as Sean alluded to, I was at the Treasury Department, where most recently I was acting chief counsel for OFAC and served in the Office of Chief Counsel during both the last several years of the Biden administration and the first year of the Trump administration. So just returned to WilmerHale about a month ago.
And I guess I'll just round out. As Donna mentioned, I used to be at the New York Fed for many years, almost 24 years. I was the head of enforcement and litigation, did a lot of sanctions type investigations, and met some of the folks on the call here, and maybe some of the folks watching as well. So, um, but anyway, so let me move on now to the meat of why we're here. So let's dive in. It's pretty clear that the Trump administration's anti-cartel and fentanyl campaign has taken center stage as a top priority. Before we start talking about some of the substantive legal issues and the implications for compliance, David, can you set the stage for folks and give us some background on what is driving this focus on fentanyl?
Yeah, thanks, Yuni. It's a great question, and I think it is important to frame this as a policy matter before we get into the details on the law and regulation and some of the risks. President Trump obviously has prioritized combating fentanyl addiction and fatalities. Most of us, especially in the United States, those of us who are situated in the United States, will have heard about fentanyl over the last 5 to 10 years, especially certainly during the first Trump administration, if not before. And we're obviously hearing a lot about it now, right? So why is that? Um, High overdose rates have been a public health problem in the United States for many years. Drug overdoses remain the leading cause of death among Americans ages 18 to 44. It's particularly prevalent among males in that age range. And to briefly level set, right, the, um, the numbers are quite staggering. About 500,000 Americans have died from fentanyl overdoses since 2012, and over 100,000 since 2021. The rate of fatalities surged around the COVID-19 pandemic, but have fallen more recently over 2023 and 2024. The Biden administration had taken some actions to expand access to treatment, medications, to boost spending on addiction treatment, and to embrace what was described as sort of a harm reduction approach through insurance and housing policies. And according to the CDC, fatal overdoses fell by around 25%, or just over 25% in 2024. But this remains a real public health crisis. Synthetic opioid addiction and abuse remain particularly prevalent in certain geographical regions in the United States. These include places like Ohio and Pennsylvania, which have particular political importance in the US political system. In the first Trump administration, the strategies to confront the fentanyl epidemic were varied. They included prevention measures, they included treatment and recovery focused measures, and finally, they included efforts to reduce the availability of illicit drugs in the country. In the second Trump administration, the focus has really been unmistakably on the third category, on reducing the availability of illicit drugs. And within that category, the types of measures that have been brought to bear have really multiplied and intensified. On the campaign trail, then candidate Trump pledged to eradicate the supply of illicit drugs and fentanyl. Immediately on entering office, President Trump declared a national emergency on the southern border arising from the flow of illicit narcotics that cause American drug overdoses. And as we'll discuss today, what has followed over the first year of the Trump administration into the second year has been a series of new uses of sanctions and anti-money laundering authorities to address the fentanyl crisis. And these are some of these are quite novel. Some of the tools that have been brought to bear on this issue are new, like classifying fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction, and there are implications of that, legal and regulatory implications of that. There are also some traditional but perhaps more aggressive efforts by the executive branch, like heightened criminal enforcement at DOJ, and of course even military action in certain respects. So why is all this happening now? Obviously, the public health crisis is a real problem in the United States. And President Trump obviously wants to address that for any number of reasons, including some of the political reasons that I mentioned. This also relates to other areas of emphasis for this administration. Border security and immigration enforcement is one, right? It's not just people coming across the border that raise concerns, but also goods in the form of precursor chemicals or narcotics. It relates to the president's policies around trade and tariffs. Two of the sources of fentanyl precursors or narcotics themselves are China and Mexico, as we'll discuss. Those are also two countries with whom the trading relationship is of particular importance to this administration. So this issue provides some leverage, perhaps rhetorically, but also in fact, as some of the measures that we'll discuss today have been rolled out or threatened to roll out, and also sort of regional sort of geopolitics in the Western Hemisphere. The authorities that we're going to talk about have been used against persons located not just in Mexico, but other countries in the Americas. And it's part of the president's national security strategy. Fentanyl does get a mention in the 2025 national security strategy. And so this is part of a sort of regional focus around the president's national security agenda as well. So one last point, which I'm sure is evident to those who are on the webinar. None of this is going anywhere. Certainly in the near to intermediate future, counter narcotics is certainly a Trump administration policy priority, and we do expect to see more of the types of measures that we'll be discussing today.
Thanks, David. That's super helpful to kind of set the stage as to kind of why we're here. So with that background in mind, Sean, I thought it would be helpful for folks to have a little historical background on the economic tools and legal authorities that the administration has been using to combat and target fentanyl-related activity. Can we go to slide 4 for this one? Sean, if you could just give a brief historical overview of the law and then explain how the administration has been able to use that legal authority. I mean, some of these laws have been in place for a long time, so I guess how or why are things different now?
Yes. So you're right. The U.S. government's war on drugs is not a new phenomenon, and this slide doesn't, it's not exhaustive. It doesn't show every law, but it tries to, draw an arc back about 25, 30 years when we started to see a shift from traditional criminal enforcement of narcotics trafficking to creative financial pressure models, a recognition that transnational criminal organizations, including drug traffickers, they depend on complex financial and logistics networks. And so these types of legal tools were developed to help disrupt supply chains, chemical procurement, and global facilitators, including financial facilitators. So we'll start with the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act. It's a core statutory tool since 1999 for designating major foreign narcotics traffickers and their networks. It was modeled on a successful IIB-based executive order, which had been targeting narcotics traffickers specifically in Colombia since 1995. But Kingpin was new because it was global. And it grants the Treasury Department broad authority to sanction individuals and entities linked to drug trafficking. And like other sanctions, it prohibits U.S. persons from dealing with the designated entities. It freezes any assets they might have under U.S. jurisdiction, and it creates an avenue for sanctioning, subordinate entities that provide material support or services to the kingpins or entities higher up the chain. Historically, this was used against Mexican, but also Colombian and other kind of Latin American cartels, but increasingly over the past 10, 15 years, we've seen the Kingpin Act used to apply to China-based precursor suppliers and money launderers. And so again, the concept here, the framework is to target the network, not just the kingpin at the top of the pyramid, but everybody beneath him on the pyramid. Executive Order 13224 from 2001 enters the picture. Back in my day, some people thought narcotics trafficking and terrorism were unrelated social ills. But as we'll see in a moment, the use of financial tools to target terrorists as well as narcotics traffickers are starting to converge. Also there was it's not on the chart, but there was a transnational criminal organization uh, executive order circa 2011 that similarly it's an overlapping tool to target transnational criminal organizations, some of which are involved in narcotics trafficking, some of which aren't. So now let's shift to the last 5-6 years. The more recent authorities targeting fentanyl in particular. So the Fentanyl Sanctions Act of 2019, I believe this was the first sanction statute explicitly aimed at fentanyl trafficking as such. And it requires the president to identify and designate foreign opioid traffickers and those assisting them. Executive Order 14059 from 2021 implemented the Fentanyl Sanctions Act and establishes a broad national emergency targeting international drug trafficking, illicit drugs, not limited to fentanyl or other opioids, but as David indicated, fentanyl seems to be top of mind in identifying networks to target. Um, Executive Order 14059 has been widely used to target Mexico and China-based networks, including chemical suppliers and logistics providers. The Fend-Off Fentanyl Act was enacted in 2024. That integrates anti-money laundering tools in addition to the sanctions authorities. And this allows the Treasury Department to classify foreign jurisdictions, institutions, or sectors as of primary money laundering concern. And so it's sort of opening a new front in the financial tools. Executive Order 14157, this is where the terrorism programs converge. This executive order prefaced the designation of cartel organizations or factions as foreign terrorist organizations or specially designated global terrorists. And that can have secondary sanctions consequences for financial institutions. And it also it brings, in addition to just more laws, more legal prohibitions relating to the crime of supporting a foreign terrorist organization. 18 USC 2333 creates civil liability for aiding or abetting a designated foreign terrorist organization. And so the drug cartels are now that they're FTOs, there's potential civil liability for a financial institution or others that are deemed to be aiding or abetting their activities, and that faces potential treble damages.
Thanks for that. It's a lot, but it feels like the tools are there, and it seems that the administration is using them. So, with that stage set, let's talk about how they've been used. It seems that 2025 was a very busy year, lots of activity by both FinCEN and OFAC related to combating fentanyl trafficking. Seems there's a lot of close cooperation and alignment between the two agencies, which both, as we know, sit under Treasury. David, maybe could you explain, is there a difference in how FinCEN and OFAC approach enforcement of these laws?
Um, yeah, it's a good question, Yuhi. I would say that OFAC and FinCEN
I'm
are.
sorry, can we just go to slide 6 for this? Sorry. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I would say I would say OFAC and FinCEN are pretty closely aligned in terms of their prioritization of counter narcotics generally and the types of drug trafficking activity they aim to combat. And this has been true across administrations. During the Biden administration, Treasury launched something called the Counter Fentanyl Task Force, which was really intended to coordinate the agency's response to the issue and marshal agency resources in a coordinated way. And then during this administration, as we'll see, OFAC and FinCEN, the use of their respective authorities are very much in conversation with one another, right? You'll see an OFAC designation. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. You'll see an OFAC designation of a group or an individual linked to the fentanyl trade, and the fact pattern, the sort of topologies that are illustrated in the designation are often, if not always, the types of topologies that FinCEN has identified through its receipt of SARS and perhaps identified in its analysis, which it publishes from time to time, of those kinds of activities. They are in conversation insofar as the red flags that FinCEN will identify, which we'll talk about more on this webinar, are present in those actions. So I would say there's a high level of coordination and as I said, sort of conversation between OFAC and FinCEN. There are certainly some differences in terms of the legal authorities they rely on and what those authorities enable them to do. And we're happy to talk about that if there's time. I'll just say briefly, and I think Sean alluded to a lot of this or provided some specificity. Most of what OFAC is doing is designating persons under the authority of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, executive orders issued pursuant to IEPA, which generally result in blocking sanctions, right? That I think most of us understand. And there are some other measures that OFAC will rely on, but generally in this area, what we're talking about are blocking sanctions under IEPA, whether it's transnational criminal organizations, counterterrorism, the illicit drugs executive order, or other authorities. And then FinCEN, has its own longstanding authorities under the Bank Secrecy Act, under the USA Patriot Act. Perhaps most notably, and we will discuss this, I think, shortly. Those authorities have been augmented or enhanced by some of the recent statutory developments, and some of those new statutory authorities give FinCEN some additional tools in the toolkit in terms of the types of special measures it can impose when it identifies a financial institution or a class of transactions or accounts that are of primary money laundering concern in connection with illicit opioid trafficking. And so there are more bespoke measures that FinCEN can bring to bear: record keeping and information collection, and prohibitions on correspondent payable through accounts, limitations on funds transfers, and so forth. So a little bit more nimble in some ways, although there are also some administrative requirements of using those other authorities that OFAC is not subject to. So, different tools in the toolkit to solve slightly different problems, but broadly on strategy and policy, very, very closely aligned. And as I said, you see that in the messaging that comes out of each office or bureau in FinCEN's case when it takes these actions.
So that's interesting distinction on kind of the authority that they can use. Just briefly, let's talk about FinCEN and OFAC. Starting with FinCEN, maybe Sean, can you just give a very high level brief overview? In June of last year, FinCEN designated 3 Mexican financial institutions, Cibanco, Intercom, and Vector, as primary money laundering concerns, which has attracted a lot of attention. Can you tell us more about these designations and why they're so significant? And I'd be curious to hear, just again at a high level, what the underlying facts were and kind of what it means for financial institutions and corporations.
Yes, so that was the first use of the Fend Off Fentanyl Act, and which we discussed a moment ago. And so there are 3 orders, one for each institution. Cibanco, Intercam, and Vector was a Mexican broker dealer. Prohibits the transmittal of funds to or from those entities. Why? Because each of them was found to be of primary money laundering concern, the language in the statute, in connection with illicit opioid trafficking. For Cibanco and Intercam, FinCEN described a long-standing pattern of associations, transactions, and provision of financial services that facilitated opioid trafficking. And similar for Vector, that it was facilitated money laundering activity of the Mexican cartels. One of the realities of operating a bank anywhere is that money laundering is going to be a problem, right? And that's true in Mexico. That's true in any country. That's true in the United States. To be honest, as I read the Federal Register notices, I wondered if the U.S. government had stronger information that it wasn't prepared to publish in the Federal Register, because some of the specific, incidents that are described in the Federal Register seem pretty mild. So or at least seem hard for a responsible financial institution to identify and prevent. So, for example, for Cibanco, in late 2019, Germany and China-based precursor chemical brokers likely facilitated a shipment of hydroxylamine hydrochloride through a Mexico-based company for a cartel-affiliated precursor chemical broker. Well, the thing is that precursor chemical, that's a fentanyl precursor chemical. It's also used for photography. It's used for a lot of different, applications. And the bank processing the funds transfer may not know what the intended use of those chemicals is. Now, it is also the case in the case of Sabanco. FinCEN alleged that employees knowingly facilitated the creation of accounts to launder money. In the case of Intercom, executives supposedly met with cartel leaders to discuss money laundering schemes. So there may have been indicia of knowledge at these institutions, but the transaction standing alone, I think any one of them might have been hard to detect and identify as potentially triggering this type of liability.
I see some thumbs up going from some of the audience members as you were saying that. And we're going to talk a little bit about how banks should be thinking about and looking for things like that in a little bit. But I think those are really important points that are very hard, whether you're a financial institution or a corporation, and trying to figure out how to deal with all of that. Julia, what have you seen as some of the knock-on effects of these designations in your world?
Hey, Andy. So the three designated financial services companies, they held about $22 billion in assets. And so I think overall it didn't impact a large part of the Mexican financial system. There were unanticipated impacts. There was some downstream effects on public works and trust accounts. And one of the designated institutions had 25% of certain of the public works and trust related accounts. So we saw that there was an immediate involvement from the Mexican government when this came out, right? They needed to restructure, they need to move all of these accounts. And so it definitely created a bit of operational disruption, kind of well beyond these three. And so in talking to some of our clients and local colleagues on the ground, what were some of the things that were done, following these orders? So the first was that these Mexican institutions, they started to look to see what was their exposure, direct, indirect, to these three designated financial companies. So they looked across customers and counterparties, payment flows and things of that nature. And then the second thing was that they needed to now onboard some of these customers. And so doing the normal sort of KYC wasn't enough. So they were starting to do kind of well beyond the standard requirements. They started to look at some data-driven reviews, analytics. We helped facilitate some trainings as well. Separately, our team also, we have a team of former FBI agents, so we helped conduct some physical security assessments as well, because there was concern that there would be, the cartel folks would potentially move to these other financial institutions that were now being sort of forced to onboard the customers from the former three. And so we've been talking to them for quite a bit of time. Obviously, this happened in the fall. And one of the themes that remains consistent is there's this level of fear and uncertainty by a lot of the other financial institutions of whether or not they could be next. And so there's a lot of focus on enhancing compliance programs, making sure that they're clearly demonstrating that they have a proactive compliance program in place, and we continue to talk to them and support them in that effort.
Yeah, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Shifting to OFAC, David, just at a high level again, can you describe some of OFAC's recent actions under the new administration and under these recent legal authorities. And do you see a theme or particular focus? I mean, I don't need you to go into each of the ones, but just maybe there's something thematic that you can share that you're observing.
Yeah, no, I think there are themes that emerge, and these two groupings here are helpful. We don't need to go into all the details, but on the left side we have these two cases with the heading digital marketplaces, the September 24th action, the March 4th action. The first involves an online pharmacy. The online pharmacy was alleged to have supplied counterfeit pills to U.S. consumers and work with drug traffickers to fulfill orders with pills laced with illicit synthetic drugs. Obviously, not all online pharmacies are engaged in that kind of activity, and this I think gets to Sean's point about how you discern licit from illicit activity. But it is also the case that there is illicit activity in the online pharmaceutical retail market. When OFAC took the action, it noted a 2024 DEA notice on the dangers of online pharmacies. That includes, some helpful indicators that can be used to inform a bank's compliance program. It's not perfect, but there are some indicators. And then the second action there involves an individual who administered an online darknet marketplace that had been sort of designed with what OFAC described as built-in money laundering features, and drug traffickers use the site to sell fentanyl globally. And so both of these sort of involve this kind of online mischief, but also when it comes to the darknet, there are also some resources which I think we'll talk about, and our friends from E&Y will talk about. There are some topologies and some red flags that can be leveraged to improve compliance when you're trying to suss out whether those kinds of digital tools are being used. On the other side, on the other column, under the heading cartel-related trafficking, we have, as I was discussing, we have a lot of messaging that I think reveals the administration's particular areas of concern when it comes to either the sort of trade dimension of this, the supply chain, or the financial side of it, whether it's money laundering or particular types of financial transactions. And so that's it's helpful when the OFAC designation sort of points the compliance community to particular resources, as it has in these cases. And so just to give you an example, right, one of the cases against the Sinaloa cartel network involved money laundering practices that are probably on the first slide of every money laundering presentation that everyone on this webinar has ever been presented with. Basic stuff like large bulk cash transactions. And so one of the takeaways may be that some of the existing compliance procedures and some of the traditional compliance tools that banks use can be brought to bear on this set of issues. And suspicious activity reporting and some of the other kind of basics of bank compliance have, in connection with the fentanyl trade, have long predated this latest wave of focus. And so some of what you are all already doing is either a necessary component of a program designed to address these kinds of issues, or can be sort of tweaked at the margins to address some of the particular topologies that present themselves. And I think a lot of the OFAC actions, as I was saying, the OFAC designations include messaging that points the compliance community in that direction.
So that's interesting because it feels like there's a lot of things that corporations and financial institutions are doing right now that are kind of their bread and butter when it comes to compliance and risk mitigation. And I think you're right, they should be using the tools that they have in place. Um, but I guess, and maybe Sean, I'll direct this at you. Why are these recent actions different? I mean, are there different legal risks or exposures that financial institutions and corporations should be aware of that don't fit into the traditional box of compliance and risk mitigation when it comes to sanctions and these types of issues? Like, what's different and why is it?
Right. I'm not sure it's very different. I think it's accelerating, and I think there's an
Can we just go to the
increasing.
next slide? I'm
Oh,
sorry.
sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think we're seeing an acceleration. I think the legal risks are becoming cumulative. uh, I think with the FTO designation, look, there were already laws against narcotics trafficking. There were already laws dealing with some of these same cartels. But I think by calling them FTOs, that does raise the profile and the risk of getting a little too close. And I'll just say another word about the civil liability under 2333, right? For years, banks have been dealing with civil litigation brought by very sympathetic victims of terrorism who allege that because the bank may have, had some involvement in a state sponsor of terrorism or in or perhaps closer to a designated terrorist organization, processed funds transfers that were ultimately for the benefit of Hamas or Hezbollah, that the banks face potential liability for aiding and abetting the activities of the designated terrorist. It's not hard to imagine a very sympathetic plaintiff, maybe family members of people who died from fentanyl overdoses, having a grievance against a designated cartel, but suing the bank that may have been doing the things that are described in the Cibanco, Intercam, and Vector uh, Federal Register notices. So I do think the legal risks have always been there, but I think they're accelerating.
And is that because of the designations of these cartels as FTOs, so that if you touch it, you could potentially, whereas before that designation wasn't there, so there wasn't that added risk. Is that a fair accumulation of risk that you're talking about?
I think so. I think there probably would have been like a common law tort or similar kind of legal. There's legal and reputational risk from being abused by narcotics traffickers. And every, financial institutions have been trying to fight that for years with their AML compliance programs. But I think the FTO designation just sharpens the reputation risk and does add and introduce new legal risks.
And what are the implications for that? Is there criminal liability? Is it civil? Is it monetary?
Yes, so
All of the
there's,
above?
yeah, there's all of the above.
Okay. So maybe just shifting gears then for Donna and Julia, given these additional legal and liability risks, it seems that maybe financial institutions and corporations really can't rely on their current existing AML sanctions compliance programs to navigate cartel-linked activity. So maybe what can they do to mitigate these additional risks and liabilities? How do they detect these, things that might indicate fentanyl-related supply chain activity? It just seems like a really difficult thing to be able to be proactive and develop. So I don't know, maybe you guys can talk about some of those things and maybe we could turn to slide 10 for some of the red flags.
Sure, thanks. And I'll start. And I agree with you, Yoonhee. And I'm also going to address the fact that we're talking to banks, but we're talking to global corporates as well, and pharmaceutical companies and people who, or entities that maybe use the technology to help, because no one is off the hook here. I mean, certainly pharmaceutical companies and precursor chemical activity, are very much on the hook as well, both for the civil liability, not maybe for FinCEN, but OFAC and other regulatory or enforcement agencies if they're found to have engaged with FTOs directly or indirectly, and the determination is you knew or could have known or should have known. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But I mean, common red flags, you always sort of start with if something has changed for no good reason, take a look at it. If you have KPIs, if you have things that sort of tell you this is how many, we usually see of this, and suddenly it's up by a multiple of 5, or 10. I mean, is it a tariff evasion? Is it something where, someone else is trying to come in the door because who was there before can't? So from a compliance standpoint, it's always good to just look at something. You hate to say if you see something, say something, but if something suddenly changed without a good reason, investigate it. And, also set the stage of, everybody should be doing risk assessments, whether they're corporate or whether they're financial institutions, but don't keep those just in columns. Look across. If there's a suspicious activity, but it doesn't fall in your ABAC bucket, maybe you push it to the person in FinCrime or something else. So you're really giving it sort of the full review, and you can say that you really did look under every stone. But just to highlight a few, I mean, we've talked about precursor chemical activity, and the thought is, are you getting more of those? Again, bank or corporate, is suddenly that being increased? Are there new entities coming to you that you don't know as well? Are there new players coming in? Because those doing precursor chemical, again, 100%, they could be very legit. My daughter's a photographer, so I get that these things can be very legit. But you want to look at why is this suddenly being increased, and do you know the company, and have you checked who the company does business with? And we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. Suspicious advertising, this comes in your due diligence. If you try to look up a company, are they using sort of coded language or unusual shipping methods, or trying to bypass, or something that just doesn't smell past the smell test, in terms of, this doesn't look like it's trying to attract the gold star buyer, if you will, or more of those maybe who like to surf the dark web. Complex organizational structures, suddenly do you see something that maybe has 4 or 5 different layers, and we'll see this on the next slide, where it seems like those layers might be there just to sort of block or blur who's really at the heart of it, because lots of organizations don't want to go beyond 1 or 2 reviews in terms of third party and third party and things like that. And there's a lot of discussion about how much do entities need to do, and we'll talk about that also on the next slide. But again, if something looks much more complicated or more complicated than it needs to be or used to be, it's certainly worth investigating. Unusual communication channels, as a bank or as a global corporate, how you usually communicate with entities, the channels you go through. Now are buyers being directed to encrypted apps or informal channels, or something that just doesn't seem like it's the right payment or communication channel? And certainly payment structuring, nothing new there. I mean, payment structuring has been around for a very long time, but it's also a vehicle through which entities who are trying, to hide the ball, if you will, or hide the bad activity, can just put it under so many different layers that it's hard to follow. And, we see this at banks as well, where an entity that passes all the due diligence opens an account, but then they open correspondent accounts or shell accounts or things like that don't get the same level of due diligence, and that's where bad actors can sort of slip in. So I think the moral here is these are good red flags, but look at your program, and anytime you see sort of an uptick that doesn't have an explanation, investigate it a little deeper. And then,
So can I just ask you a question
sure,
on
of
that?
course.
So it feels like everything you said are things that banks and corporates are probably doing now. So what is the added layer that they can detect fentanyl related activity? I mean, as Sean said at the beginning, the precursor things, I mean, it just seems really hard. And I'm sure there's not a perfect answer for this, but as compliance folks or legal folks are listening, are there additional terms they should be adding? Are there additional monitoring metrics they should be adding? Like, I mean, just generally speaking, what are you advising folks with regard to enhancing or maybe supplementing or just adding completely new metrics for
Right, right.
this?
And I think it depends, of course, on the program. One of the things is that, very often an institution will look at who are they doing business with, right? Who are the beneficial owners? Maybe who are some of the larger suppliers? they don't necessarily go to the next step or the next step. They don't go 3 or 4 or 5 layers deep. We did see some of this in the Ukraine when the Ukraine-Russia war started, and suddenly there were big blocks in supply chains, and there was also reputational risk. You didn't want to be dealing with someone, and so entities, rather than just sort of doing the regular due diligence, took it out 2, 3, 4 steps. And there is that technology to do that, but it takes more time and it takes more effort and it takes more money. So, but I mean, that's an area where, and again, it depends on your risk level. We are seeing entities going deeper. So rather than just having maybe a 2-step process, they're doing something more. Maybe they're running things through their checks and balances more often. Rather than just screening and leaving, just rescreening, making sure they've got negative news, up to date, using those sorts of channels. I mean, terms, yes, absolutely. Depending on the business, there may be terms they want to add in to their screening process that are more focused on this. But I mean, those are, sort of off the top of my head, the things that entities can and maybe should be doing depending on their risk. The other thing I will say though is there's sometimes a thought that, well, I'm a small bank, nobody's gonna come to me, they're gonna go to these big banks, and then you see them exactly for that reason, go to a small bank or a branch who thinks like they'd never come to me, I'm too small, and they don't have the same check. So like no one should assume that they're safe because they're too small, they're not known, they're not in the right location, because we've seen that as well time and time again, where someone skips the big bank who has the very sophisticated screening and goes to someone else who thinks it's his lucky day because he got this great account.
And Sean and David, one of you maybe, to Donna's point, maybe legally they're not required to go 3, 4 layers down. But if there are, tools out there that can be purchased for whatever cost, maybe a lot, maybe a little, depending on the size of the bank, and they choose not to do it because technically they're not legally required to do that. What are FinCEN and OFAC? How are they going to react if they're that small bank that happened to be the lucky winner of someone that decided not to go to the big bank that has a big tools and goes to them? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think in that situation, FinCEN and OFAC would be the least of my worries. I think the bank supervisor or law enforcement or others, what was reasonable and whether the bank had sufficient knowledge or reason to know of the money laundering activities of their clients, that's going to be judged in hindsight on like the worst facts you can imagine. So I think it's certainly there's no expectation to boil the ocean, but I think I think prudence is what's called for. There's a comment in the Q&A chat I saw where somebody commented, silos are a problem of keeping fraud, ABAC, AML, and OFAC separate. It's all financial crime. And I do agree with that. I think, and if you so two fairly recent examples. If you look at what happened with Lafarge and their issues with respect to alleged transactions with ISIS, or if you look back 15 years or more with Chiquita Brands and their alleged transactions with the FARC, that wasn't something that their payment filtering process would have caught. It was really they were paying bribes, and the anti-bribery and corruption program was something that needed attention. So I guess this is why I'm just echoing what the comment says. I think for the small bank that maybe doesn't have infinite resources, I think it's still helpful just to think holistically about the challenge and what aspects of their governance can help uh, prevent facilitating activities by what is now a foreign terrorist organization.
I don't know, David, if you have anything to add there with respect to OFAC. I do want to give the code word for folks. The code word for CLE credit is effort, EFFORT. So just want to put that out there so people have it. I don't know, Sean, you wanted to add anything? If not, I was going to move on to Donna. I think you also wanted to talk about the complexity of the fentanyl cartel supply chain and how that
Sure.
can impact compliance. this
Right.
this 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 kind of was like, wow.
Right. And I mean, in those, for those who do correspondent banking or other complex transactions, this is like, yeah, we see this all the time. But, what this shows is at the bottom, again, whether you're a bank, or a pharmaceutical company or someone dealing, you might be used to dealing with a certain company, right? But maybe now they suddenly have individuals that company deals with that lead to cartels. Um, and going back to, I think what Sean said, dealing with an FTO exposes you to civil liability. And that can be a very, very large penalty, as he alluded to. A class action brought by people who've lost loved ones to fentanyl will be reputational risk, and telling a court or a regulator, well, we didn't want to spend the time and money because we know the technology exists, is often not a winning argument. So, the thought is back to what can you do? Maybe you go deeper, particularly if you have some reason to think that something's changed here. There's more people in the pie. We've screened things. Manufacturing company B didn't used to be connected to these individuals. What's going on? But we do think that, and not everybody's doing it. And as we said, it's not a requirement, but I've heard more and more like payment processors and payment apps that are doing deeper research because they want to make sure that, if somebody can't get to a bank, they're going to go to a payment app. And this can be where they come through. So, Julia, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add here or just sort of we can move on to the next slide.
Yeah, and maybe I'll dig in a little bit more on the next slide if that's okay.
Okay.
So I think we sorry, go ahead, you're on mute. Oh, okay. So I think a lot of this has been sort of discussed through the other speakers, but I think we wanted to kind of come together, kind of what are things that compliance functions could do, and some of the things based on some of the things we've seen. So governance and collaboration, I think that goes to what Sean addressed and the comment that was raised in the Q&A. You can't approach this topic in isolation. There's so many different factors. So we've seen what sort of works best is making sure that your general counsel is involved, compliance, even your insider threat teams, security functions. Those are all critical, and they're all seeing different aspects of potential infiltration by the cartel. And so you want to make sure that there is collaboration there. You can't have information that's living in all these separate boxes. We've seen, folks in bank may say, well, this is just a money laundering issue, and therefore, I don't need to raise this elsewhere. And really, you want to make sure there's collaboration across both horizontal and vertical within either the bank or the corporate entity. The next thing is risk assessments and controls. I know Donna touched upon this as well, but it's essential that you're conducting thorough background checks and risk assessments on clients, vendors, even your employees. I think that's been a big area, especially around cartel findings that we've seen. There's been a lot of insider threat situations, especially along the border states. And this monitoring should not be a one and done, right? It means continuous monitoring. So if there's a change in ownership, cartels use legitimate businesses to open accounts, and then they may change ownership. And if you have controls in place to assess these type of changes, that's key, especially in higher risk regions, right? Particularly where we know the cartel tends to operate. Those organizations should really consider insider threat assessments, because there could be employees that are compromised. And then for monitoring and detection, I think a couple areas you could revisit here. I know we've talked about there's a lot of things in place already, but just take another look at your scenarios, especially if there's cross-border, tri-border involvement and activity. You may want to look closer at those type of transactions. We've seen high-risk branches also being an issue, right? You may have pockets where there is a lot of cash flow, and so you really want to make sure you're understanding. Maybe you want to have an on-site visit from the risk or compliance team to take a look at what is happening within the branch. And then one thing we did notice also is subjects of law enforcement inquiries and those that participate in the Patriot Act 314A, B, requests by other financial institutions, those subjects should also be looked at and evaluated. We've seen instances where 314B communication either ceases or never is responded to, and you may want to take a closer look at those, especially if it's coming from a foreign financial institution. There could be something there, and so assessing that and taking a closer look at that could be an area you may want to revisit. And then from a technology perspective, obviously regularly updating your internal databases, cross-referencing with OFAC, international lists. Um, there's obviously no listing of cartels and its members. There's no Cartel Inc. But in our investigations, we've leveraged tools. There's external vendors that help analyze customer and vendor behavior to understand sort of the networks that could exist, nexuses to cartels. And so for instance, there are listings of precursor chemical companies based in China that you don't have to, but you could add to your screening that's out there. You might also want to just be mindful of data vulnerabilities. So we've seen truncated account names, for instance, and that could really hinder identifying sub-accounts during investigations, other assessments. You may have the monitoring and tools in place, but if the account says ABC Trust doing business as 123 entity, and it's a really long name, your screenings may not be picking up that ABC Trust, that 123 entity, and that could potentially have some illegitimate ties. So you want to just be mindful of these sort of little tweaks that you can take a look at. And last but not least, I think we've seen this time and time again, educating your employees on all the recent trends, the Chinese underground currency exchanges, cryptocurrencies, peer-to-peer payments, things of that nature that are kind of specific and to this topic. There's been at least 5 related FinCEN alerts related to cartels, if not more, and they should really be considered part of your training if you haven't done so already. So I think with that, maybe we can wrap it up, and Yoonhee, back to you for anything additional.
Sure. No, those are really, really helpful. And I think lots for folks to think about because this is not easy. And I think, as we said at the beginning, I think David said, this is not going away. I think that there's going to be more coming down the road with this administration with regard to, fighting fentanyl trafficking related activity, which, is hard because just the potential consequences of missing something is just really, really big. And so, we've talked a little bit about how we advise folks. We only have a couple minutes left. We do see some questions. Um, I don't know that we're going to have time to go through them, but I think we do have the deck. We will present that to folks who are on the webinar. Um, I don't know if anyone has any closing thoughts on what they would advise is like the biggest risk that they see coming down the pike or what they want to tell folks that they should be looking for to close this out. I leave it up to folks if they want to end with a note of caution or advice.
Uni, I mean, I will say besides that, feel free to reach out to us. We're always happy to continue these discussions, 'cause since we didn't, perfect slide, get to it. I mean, yeah, my note of caution would be don't think what worked, last week or last month all still works. Keep checking because things are evolving so quickly, and taking an extra step is probably better than not taking, the step. It may seem wise not to spend the money or time, but it's so complicated, and you have to go so deep. You have to look at shipping. You have to look at all these factors. Make sure you're reevaluating and don't think what you did last year is going to work today. And in 2 months, don't think what you did today is still good without just giving it a quick check.
Anyone else? All right. Well, with that, I'm going to say thank you to my panelists and thank you again to the IIB. And thanks to everyone who joined. I hope you learned something from this. And as Donna said, please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any follow-up questions. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.